Chapter 3. Clarity. The Sasori slammed into Jimmy with the force of a freight train. Had he not been between Isamu and the alien monstrosity, with C6 coursing through his veins, Isamu would have been torn to pieces. With a speed at which Jimmy's modified brain could barely process, he saw the stinger exiting the hole, with claws open and tail raised. Jimmy threw Isamu forward, the soldier tumbling up the corridor through body parts and corridor detritus. At the same time, Jimmy slowed, dodging the claw attack as he grabbed the alien's arm and planted himself. Using its momentum, Jimmy slammed the horror into the corridor wall where Isamu had been a moment earlier. Bits of metal plating and piping broke loose. Isamu stared from the floor where he landed in disbelief. It had happened too fast for him to take it all in, but he was free, lying on his side near the turn in the corridor. "Go!" he heard Jimmy shout. Still unbelieving, he scrambled up and headed around the corner. Meanwhile, Jimmy felt his mind wanting to finally cut loose. When he'd unthinkingly touched the alien, he'd come into direct contact with his greatest fear. All the horrific imaginings that tormented him over the last few months were realized. A primal scream threatened to break forth and completely and inexorably separate him from sanity. But there was a reason to try and hold on, a silver thread to grasp. It might have been his desire to face his destroyer and rise to it, whether that was the thing he created in his mind or the thing next to him in the corridor. His mind ran over the bitterness and shame of his failures as a soldier, the disappointment of those around him, the shame that drove him into dark lockers. He realized living as an addict, giving into fear and hiding from responsibility had become a life worse than death. Angel didn't understand that. It was why he'd traded the last of what he was for the compound. And now, a momentary fleeting of calm. Clarity. He had done everything he could to avoid his fear, never giving himself a chance to beat it. Now that it materialized, he realized he had nothing to lose. He had to turn and face it to overcome it. His modified eyes were taking in everything in the slow motion of action. Isamu sliding across the floor, the creature slamming against the wall, his hand still on the chitinous flesh of the stinger. "Go!" he heard himself shout. Jimmy had crossed a bridge and it collapsed behind him. All choices were now ahead, all regrets left behind. For once he'd taken action, used a weapon that would never have been given to a man like him, and saved Isamu. He saved one man. Maybe he could do more. Stop the thing from completing its mission. Maybe save the ship and everyone on it, no matter the cost. The Sasori was just now recoiling from being thrown into the wall. Isamu was rising from the floor.
"Blast doors secure. Rules of in-ship enemy engagement are in effect. Intra-deck movement restricted. Hold your position."
The calm woman was still repeating her message. The amber lights were still flashing. And then the eyes of the alien monstrosity settled on him. Jimmy stared back with his orange, mutated eyes. There could be no communication between alien and human, and yet they understood each other perfectly. Instinctively, Jimmy ducked as the alien's tail struck, using the flashing amber light to obscure the strike. The large stinger attached to the tail brushed the top of his head and slammed into the corridor wall, puncturing the metal panel. Jimmy was weaponless and was never adept at hand-to-hand combat. C6 gave him speed and strength, but it couldn't teach him how to fight. He had no illusions he could triumph by skill in combat. He needed to beat it some other way, and he had to keep his fear and horror at bay long enough to do it. During the strike, Jimmy lost his hold on the alien's arm, and its claws were now free. He threw a forward kick into the alien's body, separating them as it reared upright, baring its claws. The stinger moved toward the hole in the corridor, positioning itself in front of a crate that hadn't been there before, as if to protect it. Jimmy understood the thing had carried it out of the lab. With his advanced sight, he quickly took in the information on the crate. It was Compound 6. It would be disastrous if the Droms were to get their hands on Earth's super-secret weapon. That's why the Sasori was here. Jimmy couldn't let that crate leave this ship. A cramp rocked his stomach, and a wave of nausea roiled through him. It was well past time for his daily whoosh inhalation. A tremor shook his left hand, and he made a fist to stop it. Terror continued its efforts to unman him. And then it was on him. Jimmy barely had time to deflect a claw strike with his superhuman speed when he realized it was only a feint. The tail came through, and the stinger stabbed him in the shoulder. In and out, a surgical strike. The beast recoiled to its position in front of the crate. Pain exploded in Jimmy's whole being. He felt poison infiltrate his body through every nerve. He lived his nightmare. The snake-like tail had struck easily, without error, and without opposition through his super senses, and felled him. Except it hadn't. He'd fallen to one knee, wanting to scream, but the C6 countermanded the poison immediately. He could almost see microscopic hexagons counterattacking within him, striking back, neutralizing, destroying. In a moment the pain lessened, and he could move, but he knew there would only be so much he could take. How could he defeat such a capable foe? He got an idea. He just had to get the beast there. Would he have to give himself up to do it? It didn't matter. He would do what he could do, and hope it would be enough. As Jimmy's conviction solidified, his fear began to dissipate. Seizing the opportunity, he closed the door on it for good. He exhaled, feeling the compound coursing within, as if it had been blocked by his horror. But he was poisoned, and his addiction was battling to derail him. There could be no delay. Jimmy jumped backward toward the airlock, surprising himself with a 15-meter leap. With the quickest of glances, he saw the inner airlock door was still open. The stinger followed him with inhuman speed, but speed that Jimmy knew he could match. But that tail! It had already gotten him once. The Sasori skittered forward, happy to engage his tiny prey, now that the crate was out of danger. The distance between them closed in a heartbeat, and the alien struck immediately with the tail, forgoing the claw feint like before. Jimmy dodged it, then reached out to grab the tail, but missed. The alien held up its claws and raised itself up, looking strangely like a boxer. The tail and stinger wavering back and forth like a snake, waiting to strike with deadly speed. Jimmy feared what the claws might do, but he had to get that tail. As both hunter and prey momentarily considered their next move, there was commotion at the other end of the corridor. "Time to squash a feckin' bug," said Gia, holding her blaster. Isamu and Jeff stood next to her, brandishing their own weapons. They fired. The Sasori was unaffected by the blaster fire. The alien seemed to hesitate between charging the newcomers, fighting off Jimmy, and protecting the crate. Jimmy saw a chance and went for the tail. Lacking proper training, the thrust of power generated from his leap was unexpected. He flew past the alien and crashed into the opposite wall. The stinger pivoted to face Jimmy, who was now near the crates and on the side of his companions. "What the bloody hell are you doing, Jimmy?" shouted Isamu. "We'll lay down fire. Let's get out of here." Jimmy knew there would be no time for that, and indeed the Sasori pivoted quickly and darted at him, claws snapping. Without thinking, Jimmy dodged the strike and kicked the crate toward Isamu. "It wants that!" he shouted. "Take it!" The creature, upset by this unexpected turn of events, swung toward the soldiers, exposing its tail to Jimmy. "Fecking kill that thing!" said Gia, raising her weapon, but Isamu slapped it down. "Jimmy's too close." "Does it really matter?" "He saved me." Jimmy heard none of it. When the alien turned, he lunged forward and grabbed the tail. He planted his feet and turned toward the airlock. "Holy hell, what is he doing?" asked Jeff. Jimmy thought back to his college football days. He dropped his hips, planted his feet, and held the base of the tail on his shoulder with both hands. His flesh squirmed as it came into contact with the nightmare. An odd, chittery squeaking noise emitted from the alien as Jimmy took one step, then drove from the hips and began dragging it to the airlock. "Are you guys seeing this?" asked Jeff. "Can we shoot it now?" asked Gia. "Get the crate," replied Isamu. Jimmy's driving legs got him within 6 meters when he felt another sting. Holding onto the base of the tail hadn't restricted the alien from striking with it. Once again, Jimmy felt poison enter his system and the compound fight it back. But it was less effective this time. He could feel the new poison linking up with the bits that persisted, attacking him from within. The sting itself was like being stabbed with a flaming dagger. He lost his adrenaline rush, and fear was once again knocking at the door. How had he thought he could do this? Jimmy dropped to one leg and turned, only to see the tail rearing for another strike. Nightmare visions of stingers buried in his flesh danced in his mind. Just then, blaster fire riddled the beast's tail and torso, deflected energy damaging the corridor walls. A blast point melted the decking right next to his knee. They were trying to help him, but the blasts had little effect on the creature other than to enrage it. But it might be the distraction he needed. Jimmy still held the tail. He forced his legs up, feeling his strength begin to ebb. Was it the poison? Was the compound wearing off? His drug-addled body breaking down? He had no way of knowing. He turned and stood to face the alien so he could see the tail. The alien was distracted, even though the blaster fire was ineffectual. Maybe it was distressed from being pulled away from its prize. Jimmy knew he had to seize the opportunity. He swapped his grip, having the base of the tail between his two hands in front of him. The Sasori raised up again and Jimmy heaved, pulling backwards this time. The alien scrabbled for purchase on the metal deck, but could find none. Step by step, Jimmy dragged it toward the airlock. The tail struck again, but this time Jimmy saw it coming. He was hurt, but C6 still coursed through his veins, and he dodged the attack. The stinger sailed by his left ear and retracted back. Blaster fire erupted again, this time hitting the deck in front of the alien. The soldiers realized they couldn't hurt the thing, but tearing up the deck under its feet might help. It did. The alien's 4 legs got caught in the floor damage. Jimmy yanked hard, with all the strength of frustration, fear, and superdrug within him. He tumbled into the airlock, the alien falling on top of him. "Holy shit, he's got it in the airlock," said Gia. "Jimmy, get out!" shouted Isamu as he grabbed the crate. The soldiers saw the addict push the alien away and bound around it with amazing speed. He reached the door of the compact space in a moment, but instead of exiting, he slammed a control on the wall. They saw his grim expression as the airlock door closed. Jimmy was still inside. Jimmy faced the stinger. Now unfettered, it raised its tail menacingly, but couldn't fully extend in the small space. Jimmy was feeling sick and weakened. Wet alien eyes stared opaquely as it shifted back and forth. Had it become unsure? Jimmy doubted anything had ever dragged it against its will before. A banging sounded at the door. "Jimmy," it was Isamu. "We'll open the door and lay down suppressing fire. No," shouted Jimmy. "You'll never be able to keep it in." As Jimmy responded, the alien struck with a tail and claw combination. Jimmy was so freaked out about the tail he fell for the feint, and the claw snipped his leg. A deep gash opened, blood sprayed across the airlock. Pain seared up and down Jimmy's leg, but it was immediately muted. Orange fluid exited the wound and quickly closed it. He could move, and did as another attack came. He barely dodged it. The poison, the wound, his withdrawal, it was all converging. Payment was about to be due, but he needed help. "Open the outer airlock!" shouted Jimmy. "It's the only way!" Outside the door, the soldiers looked at each other. "It might suck the thing out," said Jeff, "but he'll go too." "No way," said Isamu. "We can get you out." Jimmy's muffled voice came again. "No, we can't beat this thing. Help me do this one thing right." "Feck me," said Gia. There was a loud bang. From the airlock window, they saw the alien charge Jimmy and smash him into the airlock door. The window cracked. "Do it!" screamed Jimmy. "He's right," said Isamu. Jeff frowned, but nodded. Gia's mouth was set in a hard line. Isamu reached forward and flipped a toggle exposing a red button. Without hesitation, he pressed it. Red lights flashed.
"Warning,"
said a voice.
"Biological material in the airlock will be exposed to vacuum. You have 10 seconds to abort."
Jimmy was slammed against the inner door. He heard the window crack. The thing wanted out. It wanted the crate. "Do it!" he screamed, and he charged the alien, throwing all his desperation and desire for redemption into a full-on tackle. He grabbed it around the head as they crashed into the wall, just as the red lights began to flash. Jimmy heard the abort message but had no attention to spare. As he wrestled the alien, his leg brushed against his torso, and something pressed into his thigh. He remembered the injector.
8 seconds,
said the voice. The Sasori spouted inhuman noises of frustration. Jimmy was too close for a claw attack, but the tail was now free, and once again the stinger found its mark.
6 seconds.
Jimmy screamed. Compound rushed to the wound, but now had little effect. Worse, the stinger had remained in the wound, pumping poison.
4 seconds.
Jimmy reached into his pocket. He flailed around for a moment as the alien tried to shake him loose, then retrieved the injector. He thumbed off the cover, exposing the needle.
2 seconds.
The alien pulled out the stinger, and Jimmy screamed again. As the Sasori reared back for another strike, a sudden rush of air escaping the airlock caused both Jimmy and the creature to lose their footing. They slid against the rear door as it began to open.
"Airlock open,"
said the voice. The soldiers watched helplessly from the window as Jimmy fought desperately with the creature. Respect and sadness flooded through Isamu. "Who'd have thought, man?" he said quietly. "He's going to do it." Jimmy was jammed up against the rear wall with the creature. He saw one of the take-hold bars and grabbed on. His crazy vision was returning to normal, but he caught one last glimpse of the inner airlock window. Isamu's face floated there with a look of horror. The outer airlock door was open. Jimmy felt his strength waning, the superdrug leaving his system and the poison taking hold. The Sasori began to slide out, then forcefully struck the deck with its tail, embedding the stinger. It grabbed the doorway with one claw. It wasn't going to go willingly. Jimmy's body began to freeze. He knew he had only moments. Instinctively, he let go of the take-hold and leaped for the creature's neck. He landed, gasping for air and shuddering with pain. The compound was almost completely spent, but he held the injector. The alien was busy holding on with tail and claw, unable to strike. With everything Jimmy had left, he jabbed the injector into the alien's dark, spherical eye. A silent squish was followed by the remnants of the eyeball floating away. The creature shook violently and lost its claw hold. Both it and Jimmy slid around the pivot of the tail, still secured into the decking. Jimmy barely hung on, as he and the alien were now dangling into open space. But the creature was doing its best to re-enter the airlock. "No way," thought Jimmy. Gasping for breath, he stabbed the other eye, destroying it. The creature shuddered again, and the stinger partially came out of the deck. Chest heaving, Jimmy climbed the tail to where the alien clung for life. Black spots rotated in his eyesight. Thoughts of insects biting and snakes strangling him filled his brain. His skin froze and cracked. Poison coursed unfettered through his body. He reached the stinger and grabbed on. Once more he saw Isamu's face in the window. The man simply nodded. Jimmy pulled with everything he had left. His skin tore and his lungs collapsed. As he choked, he floated free of the ship and saw the stinger writhing and convulsing in the open vacuum. Jimmy floated, no longer feeling anything, knowing these were the last few seconds of his life. But he'd regained his dignity. He'd faced his fear head-on and climbed out of the hole he'd fallen into. A hole he thought to never escape. White starlight replaced the unnatural orange in his eyes as his hand released the injector. His mind finally at peace, Jimmy smiled as he floated in the quiet peace of eternity. You've been listening to Stinger, written by Tom Dell'Aringa, read by Steve Ogden. Copyright 2020. Music by Kai Engel.